Eliza, tell us about the report that was issued, I think last month, July, I believe, or maybe even June, housing costs of the top public schools around the country by Cotality, which for those that don't know, Cotality changed their name, previously CoreLogic, Upper Data, who does a lot of research, probably the top research company in terms of all real estate around the country. Tell us about this report, high level.
Yeah, thank you, and nailed the new name. Thank you for spruiking the Cotality rebrand there. So probably worth going back a little bit. This all came off the back of the fact that we started doing this new kind of analysis, which was custom boundaries. So we could essentially draw a shape on a map of the housing market and analyse everything within that boundary. And we thought, you know what? That kind of means that we could draw the shape of school zones. Some school zones in Sydney in particular overlap with one another. So what we did was we created these kind of clusters of top public schools and tracked the property markets within those boundaries and looked at how houses in the same suburb but outside the catchment performed in terms of value change, price, rents. And what we found was that even though a lot of these markets inside the catchments had a price premium, they didn't necessarily outperform from a capital growth perspective. From a long-term capital growth perspective, looking at a 15-year period, we actually found in 6 out of 9 clusters that we analysed, it was actually the out-of-catchment areas that outperformed. But inside the catchments, they still performed fairly well, maintained that price premium, and generally had tighter selling conditions. So on average, shorter days on market, things like that. And if I can just add, the question that we were trying to answer was looking at specifically very popular, well-performing public school catchments. The idea was to understand, is it worth paying that price premium to be in the public school catchment to save on private school fees?
Yeah, and we even see it. I'm in the weeds every day, so we do see people actually weighing that up. I was talking to a client recently in Sydney who was looking at moving from their terrace house in Wallara out to another area, and they were really considering the private school fees that they would be paying if they got to move to that bigger home for their family. So people are really considering that on the micro as well.
Absolutely. When you look at independent school fees, they can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars just over the secondary term, and that's just for one child, right?
Yeah.
So depending on your approach to education, you might find it more beneficial to buy into one of these good state school catchments, even where the premiums are very high. So the highest one that we found was we made this cluster around Kalara High School, Linfield Learning Village, and Willoughby Girls because there were overlaps of the actual catchments. When we compared in-catchment housing to out-of-catchment housing, the price premium was over $1 million for a house within that catchment. It was $1.3 million to be more precise. Now, part of that is because we weren't controlling for other factors. So if you look inside the catchments, it also has all the train stations, and that was another thing that was lifting up the value. So again, it kind of depends on how you value education, amenity. I think the other really important thing to note here is that while we looked at the top performing state schools outside of independent schools, outside of selective schools, when you look at overall school rankings and you start to reintroduce your independent schools and you reintroduce your selective schools, those top performing state schools that we looked at unfortunately fall right down the list in terms of their rankings. So again, there is a education indicator there that needs to be weighed up as well.
It's really divided opinions on schooling, isn't it? With parenting, and it's a slippery slope to get into a conversation with other people about, because there's just it really is what suits your environment and your child, and even within the family, one child can be very different to another child who's suited maybe to a better school. And some, as you mentioned, people put higher priority on schooling more so than others. But going back to your example of growth, how properties outside of those school zones performed inferior. Let's go to what inferior actually means. So in 15 years, the growth in the school catchments was 126% versus outside of the areas 150%. I'd still take that as a win, Eliza.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. So again, that was for the Kalara High Linfield Learning Willoughby Girls High School cluster. So yes, I think in that case, if you have a few kids that you want to put through decent schooling, that is certainly a very appealing kind of return over the long term. There were some, I guess, bigger variations. The lowest was around 80. Yeah, the lowest was around 80%. So that was in Melbourne's Princess Hill and University High cluster. In catchment, houses grew 80% over a 15-year period. Outside, it was 106%. So maybe a little bit more of a difference there. But again, there's no areas that are necessarily flatlining or showing really weak performance over that 15-year period.
And just confirming, this is for houses in general, or is it the whole market? Only houses?
We only looked at houses for this research. Yeah.
So if we went 2-bedroom unit, not relevant to this conversation.
That's right. And that's an important consideration as well. I guess it was a little bit of an assumption that we were making about families and young families and schooling and the traditional kind of house and land model. But even looking at things like rents, we found that rents for these houses in the catchment were generally higher than outside as well. So, depending on a couple of different housing considerations, it seems that you've got to pay that premium if you want to get into the catchment areas.
Yeah, that example that you gave with 80% in catchment, could that, over the 15-year period, could that have been affected by the fact that they had already had that growth beforehand because people wanted to get into those areas earlier?
Rachel, that's a really good point. And I think it could also be because there's a premium on top of them. So what I would imagine is that there's just kind of an affordability threshold or limit that gets hit and puts a bit of a cap on the long-term growth rate. So you're quite right. In fact, it was interesting to see one of the places that outperformed was the Elizabeth Murdoch College catchment. That was one of 3 areas only that outperformed in long-term growth, and that was coming off a slightly more affordable price point. It had more room to grow. Not only that, but the school itself has been flourishing in recent years and rising through the rankings recently. So there is, I guess, a bit of a difference in the dynamic between more established schools with these good reputations versus those up-and-coming areas.
I suppose, like Rach and I are both parents, so we're in the weeds of it every day, and the big decisions of where to send our kids to school is relevant, and we're obviously talking to other parents that are doing the same thing and in the trenches. The thing that we notice is schools can change in status, maybe depending on their ownership or people moving to, not their ownership, their leadership, or people moving to the area. All of a sudden there's a great principal takes charge and brings the school into line and has a really good culture. And on the contrary, the principal leaves and is replaced, unfortunately, by someone that's inferior in culture driving, and all of a sudden the school has, I suppose, less of a appeal to it for the local people. How do you see that playing out in these situations? Because I would imagine that majority of these schools that you've analysed, or the catchment zones, are all blue chip suburbs around the country.
Yeah.
Or Melbourne,
Okay.
Sydney anyway.
That's a great point. That's a really interesting point. So I did have a little bit of a look at rankings over time. Generally, a lot of these schools held their strong rankings. And I think you could argue there is a virtuous cycle where once a school starts to develop a good reputation, you get maybe relatively high income households that start to move into those areas. And so that socioeconomic shift can also have a positive influence on the performance of the school. So that's what I mean by the virtuous cycle, is that once the reputation starts to improve, it attracts higher income families, and those higher incomes can also have an impact on the performance of the child in the school. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm sure with that, the teachers would be more attracted, like the better quality teachers would be attracted to that kind of school as well.
Exactly. So I think it's relatively rare for a school with a good reputation. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about management and how that influences the culture and performance of a school. But it seems to be fairly rare because of that virtuous cycle impact. And maybe you could say the same for areas where property markets in themselves are rising and areas that are gentrifying. Maybe that has an influence on the school as well. I guess ultimately, like, there is a little bit of a unfortunate trend highlighted where we should have more kind of equality in the quality of education available to people no matter where they're buying into.